But in these short verses, Revelation 12, 1 to 6, and then 13 to 17, in those two little passages, we see the conflict that's been going on from the beginning. Think about how long this has been going on. When Satan heard God promised the seed of the woman in Genesis 3, he immediately tried to ruin God's word by having Cain kill Abel. See how clever he is? He heard God talk to Adam and Eve, and he said to them in the curse, he says, but the seed of the woman will crush the serpent. He thought, seed of woman, that's child. Yeah, they have two kids, and one of them's better than the other one, the goody two-shoes Abel. And he incited Cain to kill Abel. That was his first destructing plan of God, his first desire to destroy it. Secondly, Seth was born and started a godly line of promise. So Satan's infernal plan was to inbreed demons with the godly line and totally corrupt the line of Messiah. So God saved the last pure family and drowned everyone else. That's the flood. That's Genesis 6 through 8. That's why God flooded the earth. Satan had corrupted genetically the entire human race by having this demon influence, this intrusion in. You say, how do you know that? Read what Peter said and Jude said. When Jude talks about the sin of sodomy and homosexuality in Sodom and Gomorrah, you know what he says in the very next verse? In like manner also, the angels who kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, God has reserved an everlasting chains under darkness. So there was sexual sin paralleling between the time of the flood with demons and Sodom and Gomorrah, and we're not in Genesis, but that's what's going on. Thirdly, after the flood, Satan lured the line. He followed the line and lured Abraham into moon god worship. By the way, that's what the Bible says. The gods that our fathers served on the other side of the river, Abraham was a moon god worshiper. He lived in Ur of the Chaldees. He worshiped Allah. Don't ever forget that. This whole Muslim thing wasn't invented by Muhammad. It was invented by Satan. It's been around. Read the history of Islam. He didn't invent it. He was an automatic writer under the occultic influence of the devil, and he wrote down the Quranic verses, the inscriptions. That's what Rushdie got so much trouble saying, and they're trying to kill him. But it's history, if you read it. But God protected, and though Satan thought he had won, God called Abram out of Ur. And Abram left the moon god of Ur and turned his face to the west and walked to the promised land and followed the true and living God. And that was one of the turning points in history in Genesis 12. Then, Satan's infernal strategy was to get Abram impatient and thereby get the line defiled by Hagar the Egyptian. But God picked the son of promise as the second-born. Did you ever catch that? How many of the sons of promise are not the firstborn? Seth was not the firstborn. Jacob was not the firstborn. All the way through, Solomon was not the firstborn. But the line of promise, God says, I don't have to have a firstborn. I'll take the one I pick. And so God picked Isaac. Then the famine drove Israel into Egypt, where Satan tried to kill all the male children as they were born and destroy the nation and get rid of them then. So God allowed him to do that. And then God instituted the Passover and killed every firstborn of the Egyptians. And they gave up. And Satan's plan was foiled, and they let Israel go. Well, as we go out of Exodus into the book of Judges, the successive waves, the Canaanites, the Philistines, the Arameans, the Assyrians, the Ethiopians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and by the time we get to the New Testament, the Romans, all came and tried to do Satan's bidding and destroy the Jews. Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig on the altar and enraged the Jews and slaughtered them by the hundreds of thousands. All of them doing Satan's bidding. After they were dispersed, the people grew into a group that has experienced the horrors of pogroms, extermination attempts, outright oppressions, like God's people, the Jews. No one else has had that, because Satan has always found his person. And I believe there's an Antichrist in every generation. I think that Hitler was the one for the 40s. I don't think he is the Antichrist. He's an Antichrist. He is Satan's choice. Satan has one lined up for every generation that he's going to have to take the world stage. And God just holds him down, and lets him get defeated by little logistical errors. Hitler was a genius. He should have won the war. God foiled him by his pride, overreaching into Russia and missing the oil fields of Romania and a lot of other stuff he did. But God allows Satan to get queued up on the stage, his Antichrist. And that Antichrist, the small letter A ones, have always targeted the Jews. Because Satan hates God's people of promise. And if he can get rid of them, he can get rid of the promise and the promise maker. Of course, in 1930s, Hitler arrived, came within 2 years of wiping out over half of all the Jews and their homeland. He would have had all the Jews except for those in the West, and he would have had their homeland, but the Allies defeated him. But today we see an even more deadly scenario. The entire world, because of our interconnectivity through communication and the internet, is slowly lining up behind the notion that the nation of Israel has no right to exist as a distinct entity. In the recent speeches of Arab leaders, we see a growing drumbeat of hatred and a desire for not just the lessening, but the extinction of the children of Israel. Just let me read over the last 7 years. Syria, when Pope John Paul II went to Damascus 7 years ago, the defense minister of Syria asserted that killing Jews is a duty for Arabs. He said on live international television, "We live in a tradition of martyrdom, and when I see a Jew before me, I kill him. If every Arab did this, it would be the end of the Jews." And the Pope just sat there without saying a word. Because that's not deviant from their doctrine of the Christ killers. Then we got to Saddam Hussein the next year. Remember him, why we attacked Iraq? You know what he said? "The principles of Islam and the teachings of Jesus Christ make it imperative for us to take the road that satisfies God in our conscience, and that is the road of jihad." And what he said was, remember, he's the one that got the group that was going to march and overtake and march in Jerusalem and take it back and destroy the Jews. And that's why George Bush the first decided that would be the spark that would ignite the Middle East. And the first Gulf War was not merely about oil, but about Saddam Hussein's desire to jihad and liberate Jerusalem from the Jews. Well, more recently, the Palestinians, in fact, last month, which was only 6 days ago, last month, the General Assembly of the Palestinians met, and they declared Jerusalem, listen, this is what they said, the 24th of August. Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine, it is the capital of the Arab world, it is the capital of the Islamic world, and it is the capital of the Christian world. Who did they leave out? The ones they want to annihilate. The Palestinians went on to say that the only way to do it is getting rid of the Jews. Here the Jews are providing them with medical aid and everything else that they provide. They're mortal enemies. They provide the Palestinians with enough to continue existing. And the Palestinians declare in their General Assembly that Israel needs to be annihilated. And then, most recently, August 30th, 7 days ago, the Daily Iranian, old Iran, said that the world must not accept anything less than Israel's annihilation. That was the headlines on August 30th of the Iranian daily newspaper. Well, where we may be headed is easier to see if we back up and look at recent history. Historically, we know that Israel has faced, since they became a nation, 4 wars. And if you study history, it's a very beautiful picture. In fact, Billy Graham's father-in-law wrote, Bell was Nelson Graham Bell was his name. He was a missionary in China, and he had an interest in Israel. And in his memoirs, he talked about the miracle of Israel's preservation. It's fascinating to read. Billy Graham used to refer to it in his crusades. But modern Israel has fought 4 major wars in the last 50 years, and each one has played an important role in setting the stage for the end. If you think about it, 1947 and 48 was the restoration of Israel. That's called the War of Independence. That's when Israel galvanized as a nation, when in their unbelief they came together and Ben-Gurion said, "And we shall be called the nation of," and they had not decided what they were going to call themselves. And on the radio, if you read history, he finally says, "We will be the nation of Israel." And the whole world said, "Of what? From the Bible? You think you're that?" And that was their restoration. 1956, remember the ill-fated Suez War with Egypt? That was an assertion of their national sovereignty. And the world sat up and they said, "Whoa." So they made it in 48. Wow, they did even more in 56. The Six-Day War in 67, 42 years ago, was the recapture of the Temple Mount. If you read the chronicles of that war, there's no reason why Israel won, except God wanted them to. They were outgunned, outnumbered, outmanned, and even the U.S. wasn't helping them. We were almost betraying them. And God wanted them to have the Temple Mount. The Yom Kippur War in 1973 was them getting the West Bank. And for Ezekiel to come true, that they would get those cities and rename them after their biblical names, which they have done. And in 1993 onward, we've had the Intifada, which has set the stage for the world to say, Israel does not have a right to exist. They should just go back wherever they came from and get out of here. Through all these wars, which were relatively minor in comparison to world wars, but major for Israel's survival, Satan's strategy was always to destroy Israel through Arab armies. In the early wars, mostly armed by the Soviet bloc, but God protected His chosen nation through the sacrificial dedication of the Jewish people and the support of a handful of others. By the way, it's France that gave them the know-how to build the atomic bomb in the 50s. France. It was Britain that allowed them to have other technology, and it's been most recently the United States that's been gracious to them. If we do not recognize the conflict of the ages, the titanic supernatural background behind the observable struggle, we're not seeing history from a biblical viewpoint. Because to say all that's chance has nothing to do with what the prophets say is hard to reconcile with the book of Ezekiel, which said that Israel would come back to the land, inhabit biblical cities, and live in the land without being religious. And the vast majority of Jews are not observant. I mean, they like the culture, they like the language, they like the food, they like Passover, they don't like Shabbat, and they don't like the stores closed, and they don't like kosher food and all that stuff. But they go along with it because they love being Jews. The vast majority are in unbelief.